And the FBI is facing serious criticism after 4 of the world's top gymnasts testified before Congress about alleged failures investigating the sex abuse cases against Larry Nassar. The women are accusing the agents of first ignoring and then in some cases misrepresenting their accounts of Nassar's abuse. Now they're calling for accountability for the FBI, USA Gymnastics, and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. For more, I want to bring in former U.S. gymnast and author of What is a Girl Worth?, Rachael Denhollander, who was the first woman to pursue criminal charges and speak out publicly against Larry Nassar back in 2016. Rachael, again, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, but I'm sorry for what you've been through, and thank you for sharing your story with us. I know that since you started telling your story publicly, more than 300 women have come forward also accusing Nassar of sexual abuse, including Aly Raisman, Simone Biles, Michaela Maroney, and Maggie Nichols, who we heard testify yesterday before the Senate. Simone Biles even mentioned you by name during her testimony. So I'm curious, what did you think watching the hearing yesterday, knowing it might not have happened without you?
You know, it was incredibly powerful to watch these women testify, and I'm so grateful for the Senate for holding these hearings. At the same time, it's incredibly heavy because what we saw yesterday was just another poignant and terrible reminder of the systemic failures that allowed Larry to abuse little girls for decades. And the reality that we have to grapple with is what we saw yesterday is what most sexual assault victims are facing on a daily basis. And they don't have Olympians who can raise their case to these national spotlights. We've got to start asking the question of what's going wrong in our law enforcement, how do we do better training, and how do we put in accountability mechanisms for bad actors in law enforcement so that this doesn't keep happening. This is not a new story. We just finally got to see it yesterday.
Now, the Department of Justice released a report in July saying the FBI failed to respond to these allegations with the urgency they required, made fundamental errors when they did respond to them, and failed to notify state or local authorities or take other steps to mitigate the ongoing threat posed by Nassar. We heard the Inspector General testify that Nassar then went on to abuse roughly 70 more victims because of the failure to act quickly, and yet no one from the FBI has faced legal consequences. I know you're also an attorney, so what more needs to happen for these agents to be held accountable?
So that's an incredibly huge question, and there are multiple layers to it. There's actually over 100 little girls and young women that were abused between the time that the FBI knew and when I filed my police report in the Indy Star, put that story out there, and Larry was finally stopped. Over 100 little girls. But what we have to do is multifold. We first have to look at personal responsibility for the individual bad actors in the FBI and what needs to be done, criminal charges, and additional measures of accountability for this case right here. But then we also have to start asking what needs to change systemically, because again, this is not a new problem to sexual assault survivors. When I came forward publicly in 2016, I came with a thick file of evidence and a legal memorandum that I wrote myself arguing the case and how it could be won, because I knew I wasn't fighting just an abuser, I was fighting a system. And we've got to start asking what we need to do differently in our systems, what better training is necessary so that detectives and prosecutors are equipped to handle cases like this. That requires resources to be allocated. We need to start having hard conversations about sovereign qualified immunity in our country, because the reality is that under our doctrines of qualified immunity, there are almost no mechanisms for holding bad actors of law enforcement accountable for what they've done, either criminally or civilly. And that's a big problem, because what we have here in this country is an entire group of people, law enforcement and prosecutors, who hold all the power, who we're dependent on to take the right actions, and yet there's no mechanisms for holding them accountable or pursuing justice when they're corrupt and acting badly and don't do those things, resulting in damage to hundreds of children.
Now, USA Gymnastics told ABC News a couple of months back that they have participated in at least 6 independent investigations. But many survivors, including Aly Raisman, say these investigations are not enough and that USA Gymnastics hasn't actually been that cooperative. So what do you know about these investigations, and what more needs to be done by U.S. Gymnastics and the Olympic Committee?
Yeah, so that's incredibly misleading, that statement by USAG, which is deeply frustrating to still hear it repeated 5 years later. The first investigation they did was called the Deborah Daniels Report. They specifically limited Deborah from examining any specific cases of abuse, including Larry. It was essentially an audit of their policy. And what Deborah came back with was a 100-page report that said essentially, hey, if you think little kids are being sexually abused, you better report it. Her recommendations were very common sense. They shouldn't have had to hire an expert to tell them those things, and yet Yet, 5 years later, USAG has implemented less than half of the common sense recommendations that Deborah put forward, and she had to put those forward without the benefit of examining any specific cases of abuse, including Larry's. Those other investigations that they're referencing to, USAG did not waive attorney-client privilege so that we had access to all of the information. They were bits and pieces of investigations that were put together. They were not comprehensive. They did not delve into, especially any of the specific cases of coaches' abuse and how things were handled at the corporate and administrative level. So to represent that they've willingly taken part in 5 or 6 different investigations is just grossly misleading and untrue.
Now, FBI Director Christopher Wray also testified yesterday. He was very apologetic and promised to ensure that this never happens again. So what do you think needs to happen next to guarantee the safety of U.S. athletes and for justice to be served here?
Well, the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be individual accountability for the bad actors in the FBI. There have not been any criminal charges levied. There hasn't even been any discussion of how to take care of the survivors who they harmed and the hundreds of little girls who were harmed because of their failure. So there needs to be individual responsibility first and foremost. The FBI needs to do much better training and much better accountability mechanisms. But beyond that, we need to start asking the question what we have to do legislatively. Because the reality is, again, our doctrines of qualified and sovereign immunity make it very, very difficult to hold any bad actors in law enforcement accountable or to make any form of justice to those who have been hurt by bad actors in law enforcement. And without a mechanism of accountability, there's no external motivation to do the right thing. We have an entire group of people who we are dependent on to do the right thing, to stop pedophiles and criminals, and they hold all of the power, and yet there's no mechanism for accountability. Those are changes that individual state legislatures and the state Senate and the federal Senate can change. We've got to start having those conversations, and the responsibility needs to start with the lawmakers to change some of those doctrines so that we have mechanisms for accountability in place, and also so that we're properly funding the right kind of training so that we have detectives and prosecutors who are qualified to handle these cases.
All right, Rachael Denhollander, we appreciate you sharing your story and your expertise with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.